we're going to talk about Laravel. And here we have our project. And here you can see the structure. So let's look at the structure. And by the way, if you're wondering how you install Laravel, to install it, you have to use Composer, which you have to install it. You have to install Composer on your system first. Make sure you read the documentation before you create a project. So we're going to do Composer create dash project Laravel slash Laravel, and then the project name. Here I already have a project, so we're not going to use this. We're not going to run this. All right, so let's look at our project. First things first is we're going to look at the env, which is right here. But I'm not going to open this because I have my database information and that's sensitive data. So we're going to open the example.env. So here is where all of your environment variables belong. What is an environment variable, you ask? It's basically a project variable that you use. For example, an API key. You need that to use certain, features. Let's say you want to implement a API that looks at weather. Let's say you want to implement a weather feature for your application. You may need a API key, and this is where you store those keys. You could store all types of things. You even see AWS access key right here, a secret key, all different types of, all different types of keys. All right, so this is where you store all of your sensitive data. So you do not want people to look at this. Okay, what you even should do is make sure that it is in your git ignore, because you do not want this on your git repository. Okay. All right. So that is our .env file. Right here, we're just going to make sure that we have our database name, and then you put in your MySQL password right here. Okay. That allows Laravel to have access to your database, your MySQL database management system. Okay. All right. So now that we put our database in here, which is my users, and by the way, if my users does not exist, Laravel would actually create a new database, given that you explicitly give it permission. Okay. All right, so let's look at our project. So we have our app, and here is where for one thing, Laravel is a MVC framework. What that means is it has models, views, and controllers. And it's basically a design pattern that most developers use to organize their code. And it makes it scalable and more maintainable. Okay. So let's look up how MVC works. Okay. So we have our user. The user has a computer and they're looking at a website, and that could be the home page. And on the home page, they could have a login or sign up button. Okay. They can have a decision to log in or sign up. Now, if they sign up, they are going to go through this workflow. So they're going to put in their information through a form, and that form is going to have a method of post, okay, in HTML. Usually forms in HTML only allow you to use get and post requests. So it's going to have a form of a method of post, and then that form on submit is then going to be posted to a route and the controller will then intercept that route and have some processes that happen. Okay, but before it's sent to our database, before it's sent, the first thing you want to do when you're dealing with user information is make sure you encrypt the password. And that's what you normally do right here. You encrypt the password. And so here, this is our sign up controller. It's also called a servlet. Okay, some people call it servlets, some people call it a controller. Okay, so it's going to go ahead and store the data into a model. This is known as a model, a data access object, or a DAO, also known as a model. Okay, and the model is essentially just taking all of the user input and storing it into an object that we created, that we set up, so that way we can then manipulate the user's information on the fly. And so we can take that object and do whatever we want with it. We can put it in an array. We can put it, in a collection, or we can send it off to the database. Okay, so here we're going to send it off to the database. Now with an MVC framework, it basically abstracts the need for writing any SQL queries. So it's essentially a library that allows us to it extracts us away from the SQL layer. So we can essentially just call a method, and that method would essentially just store it into the database. It would know that for this object is connected to this table in the database. So I'm just going to store that object into the database. That's what the library basically does. It does a lot more, and you don't need to know the background or what's happening under the hood. All you need to know is that it's using SQL to then create those queries and store it into the database. Okay, so that's what happens when we sign up. So we sign up, we just store it into the database. All right. Now, once they sign up, the controller is then going to redirect them back to the home page where they can make another decision. They can log in. Now, once they log in, it's going to then, they're going to click on the login button and then send them to the login view. And then in the login view, they're going to sign the form, and then it's going to create a post request to the login controller. The login controller is then going to look into the database, but before it does that, it'll turn it into an object. And then that object would then look into the database and say, hey, does this person exist? Is this person who they say they are? So it's going to compare the input value from the database value and say, does this person exist? If the person does exist, it is then going to authenticate. Once it authenticates, it is then going to authorize the certain privileges. So it could be a user. The difference between authorize and authenticate is that authentication is saying, does this person exist? While authorize says, what type of privileges am I going to give this user? So, it could be a admin. A admin may have more privileges. A admin could see a admin dashboard, while a user could only see a profile dashboard. Okay, so it authorizes certain privileges. All right. And while we were just talking about all of these actions, why we call it MVC is because, again, it has a model right here, a model, a view, and a controller. And that's what this is the MVC workflow, essentially. All right, so now that that's done, we are going to look at our project and see how this project basically operates. So we're gonna go ahead and look into the app folder, and we see our models. Let's start with models. And here Laravel actually creates a user model out of the box. So once you install it, it will already have a user model. And in this user model, it then shows all of the attributes of that model. Okay? So the model is supposed to show all of the attributes of it, and the attributes actually parallel the table in the database. So whenever the model is then the data is then stored into the database, it looks at the model and it looks at the table in the database, and basically stores it into the proper column that it needs to be stored in. Okay, so here is a model. This is what a model looks like. However, this is a special model at that. Okay, this is a special model, so not every model looks like this. The reason why this is a special model is because it is a user model. Other models do not need to look like this. It does not need to have a fillable. It does not need to have a hidden, nor does it need to have a cast. However, the main thing that all models need to have is called the eloquent model. And this is a generic model that is extended to the model. However, it's not being used. The reason why is because it's using an authenticatable, because this is a special model that needs to be authenticated. Users always need to be authenticated. And so this uses the authenticatable from the auth library that Laravel provides. So let's go ahead and look at the auth library right here. And here we see that the user extends a model. And that model is the eloquent model. Now, you can actually extend this directly onto the model. And that's what we do with every other model. In this particular case, the user model, like again, it needs to be authenticated. So we extend the model here, and then we implement the authentication interfaces. These are authentication interfaces right here. Okay. So just know that it uses the model, and on the eloquent model, it has various different methods that allows us to perform database operations or CRUD operations on that model. So we can actually create full operations, SQL queries, essentially, directly on the model. Okay? And that is what our generic eloquent model does. All right? Here we do not need it because it's already extended. So we're going to remove that. All right, so right here is our fillable. This, like, again, normal models do not really need this. However, what a fillable is just values that you want to be mass assignable. So the name, you want that to be assigned, by, through a form. The email also needs to be assigned, and the password. So all of these need to be mass assignable, okay, through a form. So that's what our fillable basically does. Okay. So now and then your hidden is things that you do not want to be, actually they should be hidden. They should be hidden. So it allows the authentication library to then hide these certain attributes of the model. But we're not going to go too deep into that. Let's just know that your models, they need to extend your eloquent model. Very important. They need to extend this. This is an absolute must. All right. All right. So now let's actually create a new model. So we can actually use the artisan command PHP artisan make model products. All right, it created a model products. So now we're gonna look in here. All right, so now what we're gonna do is we're going to actually created models in here because there's a lot of boilerplate. However, let's look and see these other models. All right, so what we're gonna do is say public, and we're gonna say string, and it's gonna be product name. And then we're gonna do maybe, let's say, what else comes with a product? A price. So this can be an int. So it has a string of product name and an int of price. Okay? So let's just start simple like that, all right? So now that we have our models, and then wait, let's actually create some getters and setters. And you don't really need to, but we can do this. So we can actually say, let's create the constructor as well. Public function. And then to denote a constructor is underscore underscore construct. And then you can say string name string name. Sorry, I'm just so used to Java, but string name and then int price. String name, int price, and then we can say this, we can say product name is equal to name. And we can also say price is equal to price. Okay? And then we can also put a getter. So we can say public function get price. Let's say get set. And then let's take this. public function. That. And then we're going to say get price, this, we're going to return the price, set price, we say int price, and then we can say this, and then price is equal to price. And we're just going to do the same thing with get name. Get name, this, product name, set name, return, this product name is equal to name. All right, cool. So now we have our getters and setters. And by the way, you don't need to do this, but it just makes it easier whenever you want to manipulate things on the fly and then store them into the database. It'll allow you to manipulate the, let's say the admin wants to change the price. They can then it'll then call this set price method and then change the price and then store it into the database. All right, so now we are going to create the migrations. So let's go to migrations, and migrations is stored in the database migrations. And Laravel actually give us some out of the box tables that we would migrate. And so it already has a users table. So let's look at the users table. And so let's look at the rundown of this entire file, right? This is what's called a migration file. All right. So understand that it uses a schema and a blueprint. And the schema is essentially allows you to create the schema of the database. It allows you to create the table and the columns right here. The blueprint is actually, it allows you to create the columns, as the schema allows you to create the table. Okay? So just know that the schema allows you to create the table and the blueprint allows you to create the columns. Okay? So here we say schema create users table. This is for tables, and then an anonymous function that basically has a blueprint model or blueprint class of table. And this table allows us to create the data into the database. All right, so the ID basically creates an auto incrementing ID because Laravel is guessing that you're creating whenever you want an ID, you want an auto incrementing. So it'll just create an auto incrementing ID. However, you don't need to use this. You can even use big integer, and you can say ID, and then you can say You say true. So it'll auto increment. You can say big integer ID, the name of the column, and then true, meaning that it'll auto increment. However, I don't want to do that. I just want to use whatever Laravel provides. You can even use UUIDs if you wanted to, but right now we're just gonna create an ID. So our string is the name. So our string creates a name column, and the next parameter is what's the length of the string. Right now we're using 10. Right here, it creates another string, but this string has to be unique because it's an email. So that means there cannot be duplicates of this string. All right, so this right here creates a timestamp column called email verified at, and it's nullable. Okay, so that's a timestamp of when we verify the email. Okay, and then this right here is for password. It needs to be a string. And here we can actually say 255. We can make it 255 because normally when you hash a string, normally the password will be hashed, like I said previously, and it could be 255. It could be more. It could be more than 100. So I'm just gonna, just for safekeeping, I'm just gonna have it of length 255. And then our remember token. This is basically, it essentially allows us to have a token that Laravel provides to us. So whenever we want to remember the session, we can have it auto log in. And then your timestamps creates two columns. And those columns are creation, and update. So created at, and updated at timestamps to the table. Laravel is guessing that you like to have, or you like to keep track of your tables. And so it creates those timestamps out of the box. So you can just create this method or run this method, and it'll just create those columns. Here is if you want to basically, roll back those changes or reverse the migrations. So you can say whenever you want to roll back those changes, you can actually call these basically methods of the schema object or schema class. So here we're using drop if exists, and it's saying you want to drop the table if the user's table already exists in the database. So that way we're not creating any issues. It won't create a duplicate, that's for sure, but it'll definitely create some errors if you try to. You definitely don't want to overwrite the database. It may overwrite the table, and so you want to drop this table if it exists. Okay. All right, so now we're going to create our own migration. So we're going to say PHP artisan, and then we're going to say make migration products. All right. So it created a migration file, which also gives us a date in the name of the file. It gives us a date of when we created it, and then it gives us the table name. So now we're going to look at this, and here we go. And for here, we're going to do something different. We are going to do something similar. So we're going to use a schema, but we're going to create an if statement, and I'll tell you why. Schema has table users And then we're going to say schema create. So if it has a users table, so I'm saying if the database has a users table, then I want you to create this database or this table. I want you to create this table. Create products, and then a function that then uses the blueprint table we have ID. So we have an error. Why do we have an error? Okay. All right. So we want the ID, string, and the column name. The column name would be product underscore name. Of length of 10. And then we're going to say table of a, let's say a integer of price. Actually, let's say double. We can actually use a double. And remember, being that we created a double in the database, we're going to have to create a double in the model because these need to be parallel. So we're going to have it a double, and then we're going to say 5 in total. And then we're going to say 2 in the decimal place. So we have 5 in total, but 2 of them will be in the decimal place. All right. So let's go back to our products and let's actually make this a float. Let's make this a float. Let's actually make this a float as well. Okay. All right, so let's also create a timestamp. And all I want is just timestamps. It'll create a created at and updated at column. And then what we want to do is actually another thing. What we want to do is, this is the reason why I use a if statement. So we're going to say table foreign. We're going to say user ID. I'm going to say references. ID on users. Okay, so this is how you create a foreign key. So the foreign key's name is user ID. So that's just the name. This is the column name specifically on this table. And then it's going to reference the ID, the column of ID on the user's table. Okay, so that's how you create a foreign key. However, I only want that foreign key only if the user's table exists. So if the schema has table of users, if the users table exists, then I want you to create this right here, create this table, because the foreign key here is dependent on that user's table. It's a dependent on this table. So I only want it to be created whenever the user's table is created. And then here we're gonna say schema drop if exists products. So if it already exists, then it's just going to drop it. Okay, so it's just going to reverse those changes. Okay, so now we are going to then use the command php artisan migrate. And let's hope it doesn't give me any errors, because it was giving me errors earlier. So I did not create the database. So it's saying, would you like to create it? Yes. Okay, so it does give me an error. Okay. Syntax error on access violation. User table doesn't exist in table. Table products, add constraint products, user ID, foreign key, user ID references user's ID. Okay. Let's do a sanity check on this. So it ran all of the, so here we can see that it ran all of the other tables and it migrated it, except for the products table. So here we're gonna say products. Let's just see if I change that, it'll make any difference. So the products table, base table or view already exists. Products already exists. Take in, not known, okay. Product name, bar chart 10, not know, price, double. Okay. So it's saying that it already exists. Okay, let's see if it exists. Show tables. Okay, so it does exist. Okay, so it's already here. All right, so it's giving me that error because it already exists. All right. All right, so now what we're gonna do is go to our factories or seeders actually, and we're actually gonna create a new seeder. So we're gonna go here and we're gonna go ahead and say PHP artisan make seeder, and then we're gonna say user seeder. All right, created a user seeder. And here you can create demo objects in the database or demo records. And so this is the syntax. So you have, so for one thing, what is DB? DB is part of the facades DB, and it allows you to just create queries into the database in PHP. So you can create any query. It's essentially the same as SQL, but it just uses it as a separate. It's separate from the Eloquent models. So here we are looking at the table of users, and then we're inserting the first name and then string of random of 10 characters, the last name with also random 10 characters, the email also 10 characters, dot, and then at gmail.com. And then we're saying password, some random hashed password. So it'll just create anything and then hash it. Okay, and then what we're doing is we're running this 4 times. Okay, so we can go ahead and do the same. I'm going to copy and paste this and do the same, but I don't know why it did that, but we're going to go ahead and use these. I'm going to use the str, and then we're going to use the hash. I don't know why it does that. Okay, now we're going to just run this. I'm going to run this 5 times. And you can even use a for loop if you wanted to, or create a method and then maybe like a for loop. But we're just going to run this. You can either do a for loop, you can do this, or you can use factories, which basically you can create thousands, hundreds, millions of users without needing to do any of this. Okay, because here I'm manually storing this into the database. But with the factories, you can do this. You can do this at a large scale. So that's what factories is for. So factories and seeders are different. Seeders is if you just want 5 or 10 just to test. And then factories is like you want to test the scalability of the database. Okay. All right. So our user seeder is right here. And then here we are going to PHP seed. I believe it's like PHP seed. Let's look at our documentation. Database seeding. Okay, so here's how we run the seed. Okay, PHP artisan db seed, and then the class name. So class user seeder. Okay. All right, so we're going to do that. First name, right. It does not exist. And I apologize, but it's good that you see the errors so that way you can know how to fix it on your own. All right, seeding the database, and now we can check our database. So let's say select all from users. And now we can see that it's stored all of these items in the database 6 times. Okay. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and send it to the view. So let's see how we do that. All right, to send it to a view, I am going to show you how to create a component, which is similar to React. So we're going to create a component. All right. We're going to create a component. We're going to call it table. So we're going to say PHP artisan make component table. And before we run this, let's actually look at our project structure before we do that. All right, so a component is something that is going to be in our resources. And whenever we call this method, it's going to create a directory called components. And it's basically going to allow us to just have a component or a piece of HTML that is going to then be registered in the backend, so that way we can even give it props similar to React. So this is very interesting. So I'm going to show you how to create components in what's called a Blade template. It's called a Blade template. So here we have welcome.blade.php. This is also using Blade templates. And it's a very powerful tool that can, like I said, it can basically do a lot of things that React can do. So let's create that component, okay? And let's see what happens. All right, so it created it successfully. Now we're gonna look, and it'll create it creates a folder in two places. It creates it in this views directory called components and then table. Right here, this was not here. And then it also creates it in the app directory, in the views, and creates a directory called view and then components. And so here we can actually define different props. So we can say, let's say for this, for a user, we want to see the username. We can say public string user name, and then we can say public. This is known as a class component, and it creates a component instance, okay? And so here we're gonna pass it some props. So public string and then email. Okay. Let's just call it name, just to match the model. So name and email. Okay. All right. So now what we can do is we can then register these like this. And we can say name, and then we can say email. You can even put it in a span or a p tag. And then we'll see the real magic of components. So let's create a view. We'll call it users.blade.php. And then we are going to call the component, and it's just going to be this. So it's going to be just like creating an HTML tag, but with an X, and then it's going to be a dash, and then it's going to be the name of the component. So the component is called users, and then you can either do this, and then you can even have the components have children components. You can even have children, but we don't have a children. We don't have any slots or anything, so we're just gonna have it close itself. And then to put in those props, we're going to call this right here, we're going to create these attributes. So we're going to use Let's see what we created. Name and email. I'm going to say name is equal to email is equal to email. Let's look at the documentation because I know we're going to go to Blade templates, and then we're going to go to components. So we have to call this right here, this colon, and then the attribute. And then the money sign. Okay. 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 So now let's just go to the controller for right now. We'll come back to this. So what we're going to do is go to our controller. So here is HTTP. So our controllers is stored in HTTP, and then controllers, and then it has a default controller that has the authorize requests and validate requests. So what we want to do is take this controller, because we want to go ahead and extend this controller, because this also extends the authorize requests and validate requests. So this is basically our base controller. So we're going to create a new file, and we're going to call it user controller, or we can use PHP Artisan. We can say PHP Artisan make controller user controller. Okay, we created the controller. So now we're going to go ahead and use our model and then we're going to go ahead and create some CRUD operations. So we're not going to create all of them. We're just going to create two. So we're going to say public function and we're going to call it users, and we're going to say private, we're going to say private user of user. And we're going to say this user, let's call it users. This users. And then we're going to call the eloquent model method, which is called all. And this basically returns a collection. So we can actually say collection. And we don't have to do this. This is just good. We have to return it. It's angry because we need to return it. So now we have this collection. So now that we created this method, now let's create a render to render the page. So let's create a render method. I'm going to say public function I'm going to say render, and this is going to return a view. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say users is equal to this users and now we are going to return the view, return the view of users, and now we're going to return the model. And this is going to be the name that is going to be referenced on the page. And then this is going to be the value. So these are key value pairs. So this is the key that's going to be in the view. So this is what we're going to use. And this could be like all users. This is what's going to be in the view. And then this is what's the actual value of that key, the value to that key, which references users. So it returns a view. So you see it doesn't give me any errors because it returns a view, and that view is then going to pass in the user's collection, which is returned from this user's method. Okay? So now what we're going to do is go ahead into our table, our user's page, not the component. Make sure it's on the page. So it's going to this user's page. So this is the page right here, and this is our page right here. And it's rendering this component. Okay? So now we're going to say for each instead of all users, I'm just going to say users. And we're going to say for each users as user. error. It's giving me an error. Okay. It's a bit strange, but why is it giving me this error? Unexpected token as. Strange, very strange. Even though I used it here. Okay. It's very strange, very strange. Why it's giving me that error? So now it's not giving me that error. Very strange. Okay. For each user's as user, we are then going to say user name, user email, and now we're going to render this. So now we're going to create a route to then render this. So now we are going to create a route here, and instead of welcome, we're just going to say users. Just return users. So now if we go to localhost, now if we start the server, we're going to say PHP artisan serve, and then we're going to create another one. And call it Vite npm run dev npm install npm run dev. Okay, so we have an issue. Unable to locate a class or view of component. Users. Okay, so it's saying this component does not exist. So what is the component name? Table. All right. Component is called table. Undefined variable users. Reason why, because our route, let's look at our route. So we have this route. Now we need to reference the controller, because the controller needs to intercept. So we need to go ahead and go into HTTP controllers, user controller, and then we need to say let's actually remove this. User controller, and then we want to use the method of what the method was. The method was render. It's called render. And so this basically calls the function or the method of render based upon this user controller class. So this allows me to create the logic given this route. Okay, user controller users must not be accessed before initialization. Okay. All right, so let's actually create a constructor, public function, construct. This users and there we go. Okay, so it created a random name and then a random email. And it did that 6 times. Random name, random email, 6 times. All right, guys, so next time we're going to talk about repository design, and which is a more cleaner way of doing the same thing I just did. But this is the core basis of how to basically return objects into your view. All right. So with that being said, hope you have a good day and just keep on learning.